Welcome to day 3 of the Warwick Economics Summit 2020. My name is Thomas Curran, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Avinash Dixit, Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. Professor Dixit, thank you for joining me here today. And thank you very much for your talk, highlighting how the youth can tackle corruption. It was very engaging as well. To begin with, I'd like to talk a bit about your career in general. One thing quite unique about your career is it's quite broad in focus. Rather than specializing in a certain area of economics, you've touched on many different areas, from game theory to international trade to microeconomics and more. What has motivated you to tackle such a broad scope of study as an economist?
Partly one of my teachers, Paul Samuelson, had an even bigger breadth, and one of the things he kind of taught me, not directly but by his example, is that economics is one subject. It might be divided into fields, but it's still one subject, and in fact one that interacts with a number of other subjects like history, political science, sociology, etc. So what you should be looking at are questions, and then bring whatever field or techniques might be applicable to it. The second is a kind of personal thing. I have what I characterize as ADHD in research.
Okay.
I see something interesting and jump to it without asking how it might connect with what I've been doing before. And so I often flip from one field to another in every 3-4 years' time.
And in terms of searching for those questions, how do you find something to study that's interesting to you? Is there something that...
Oh, you don't have to look. The questions are all around you. They might come to you from newspapers or magazines. They might come to you from just observing businesses in your local town, or they might come to you from reading questions about research in the literature. Any one of those things. There's no shortage of questions ever.
And in terms of balancing theory with application, how important do you think it is for economists to challenge and tackle issues affecting the world today versus focusing more on theory? Is it good to get a balance between the two, or...?
No, actually, partly governed by your own skills. So I'm an applied theorist, and so I look at the kind of questions in the way they come to me, as I said a minute ago, and see if they can be tackled using tools of economic theory or game theory. But again, there's kind of no one way that's right and others wrong. All of those things kind of combine to let the subject as a whole progress. And I don't really necessarily think about what the whole subject is doing. I do my part.
So you're perhaps best known for your work in game theory, at least in popular media. Can you provide a brief overview of what you think game theory is and why it's such a powerful approach to solving problems?
The standard definition would be that game theory is the theory of interactive decisions. Different people are choosing different things, and their choices interact with each other, and they're aware that they're interacting with each other. So what they do in awareness of this interaction is what game theory tries to explicate.
Moving on to a specific paper you've written, in 2004, you advocated for a graduated punishment to be a better approach to altering behavior, in which deviators are punished in a mild way to start with and punished more severely over time. Could you expand a bit about why you think that's a better approach to solving some of these problems?
Oh, most importantly, that's been found to be empirically a much better way to solve the problem. The standard formal game theory to that point and even now basically said that the most cooperation would be sustained by levying the harshest available punishment. But you don't observe that, and you don't observe that in many, many, many situations, as especially work by Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues in analysis and observations of collective action problems showed. So that's what we were trying to model theoretically. And I have to admit that of my theoretical papers, that turned out to be somewhat less satisfactory in the answers we got, which is why we never published it. Actually, the two co-authors on that are much, much better game theorists than I am. Mm-hmm. And if they can solve it, probably it can be solved.
Right. One kind of application of game theory has been kind of trying to understand how we can solve climate change. One policy to solve climate change would obviously be a carbon tax. Applying this graduated approach to solving that problem, would you recommend having a lower carbon tax to begin with and gradually ramping up sanctions over time? Could that work as a solution potentially?
Actually, in a sense, that's one of the biggest problems of collective action there is.
Okay.
The difficulty is not working out the optimal level of carbon tax to achieve certain objectives. Mm-hmm. The difficulty is getting countries to buy into that and not free ride on the effects of the actions of others. Mm-hmm. So that could work, but you would have to get agreement to that, and you would have to arrange effective punishments for those who cheat. You said, why not have small punishments? What punishments? What do you do to the US or China if or India if they pollute more than they're supposed to? Mm-hmm. The only proposal that exists is punishing them by levying tariffs against their exports. And that has got a whole lot of problems. The WTO doesn't like to mix trade with other things. So the collective action problem, at least so far, has not found a good solution, and I don't know if it ever will.
And do you think, given the urgency of climate change, this kind of gradual punishment is appropriate? Or do you think it's too urgent a problem to ignore right now?
Graduate, how fast? I mean,
I guess it depends.
Yeah, so the pace of graduation could be fast if the problem is presenting pretty urgently. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that anybody has had any success in calculating those things out, let alone implementing them.
So moving on to another application of game theory, in a 2016 op-ed for the Harvard Business Review, applying game theory to the Supreme Court nomination, you kind of explained how the strategic reasons behind why the Republicans were blocking Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland. Recently, there have been calls to reform the Supreme Court through make it more fair and less political. Do you think these approaches are a good idea?
I haven't studied those details.
Okay.
Actually, the 2016 paper turned out to be completely mistaken in its basic premise, which was that Hillary Clinton would get elected.
Right.
So you might as well dismiss that paper. Mm-hmm. But other than that, whether those ideas, I don't know the specific details, whether they're good or not, they're kind of beside the point, because at least so long as the Republicans retain a majority in the Senate, mm-hmm. any of those things are just not going to happen.
So one criticism of game theory and economics in general is it's quite based on models, centered on rationality. Do you think having applications with things like psychology, looking at decision-making from a non-rational perspective is important for game theory?
Sure, in many respects, and in fact, those considerations are increasingly being brought into theoretical and applied analyses. Mm-hmm. In fact, I said a minute ago in the talk upstairs that in the same kind of way, sociology should also be brought in, because how preferences are formed, rational or otherwise, is significantly influenced by sociological considerations. So yes, all of those things should be done. And the theory, although rational choice was a natural starting point for it, shouldn't be regarded as a finished work.
Right. So moving from game theory to another area of your focus, it has been international trade. As you obviously might know, recently there's been a huge surge towards protectionism in the Western world, as seen by Trump's trade war with China and recent exiting from NAFTA. In 2018, you were one of 1,000 economists who, in an open letter to President Trump, criticized this protectionism. Why do you think protectionism is such a big thing today? Why has it become such an important issue to talk about once again?
Oh, partly at least.
Uh-huh.
It has long been known that although the nation as a whole got a net benefit from more open trade, within the nation, within every nation, there'd be some losers. And since the positive net gains, there are mechanisms by which the losers can be compensated. And actually, I've done some research on that myself, and that's in the book I wrote with Victor Norman. But that compensation has always remained a kind of theoretical possibility.
Okay.
So we are telling all these people, look, you could have been compensated for your losses. We are not going to compensate you, in fact, but just be happy with the thought that you could have been compensated.
Right.
And how long could you expect people to accept that and sit quiet? So I'm not surprised at the kind of populist revolt that has taken place.
How do you think trade liberalization can be made fairer for workers such as these who have been negatively affected by the consequences of trade?
As I said, they can be compensated for their losses, but an even better thing would be to anticipate that those losses might be coming, whether because of trade or technological progress. So, for example, anybody could have seen in, let's say, the late 1970s and 80s that the days of coal power were slowly coming to an end because of technological progress more than trade. And the right action should have been to change the educational system at all levels, in especially the states that were badly affected by this change, to give the upcoming students more flexible skills, skills in different areas, etc., that would prepare them for a subsequent career that would last 40 or 50 years. And nobody thought of that till it was kind of too late. The usual problem is a kind of political inertia and just sticking to the status quo till a change is forced upon.
Right, that's very interesting. So President Trump has obviously taken quite an aggressive stance towards trade. You've studied strategy quite a lot. Has his approach to trade been an effective strategy, seeing as he's realized some gains to himself and to America? For example, following his trade with China, there looked to be a new deal with China. Could his policies towards China have been effective?
Two things about that. One is that he has said that he doesn't want to go into any multilateral arrangements. He wants to negotiate with countries one by one.
Right.
And that, from a purely selfish US point of view, is a good strategy because all those other countries are smaller. And he can essentially bully them into accepting what he's proposing. Mexico and Canada were two examples where he got them to do that. And China is a tougher entity. But the second thing arising from that is, if you look carefully, the USMCA is very little different from NAFTA. There's a little percentage change in the content of imports into the US that Mexico must produce itself, etc., etc. And all that seems to really matter for Trump is that he can say that the previous agreements entered into, whether by Bush or particularly Obama or Clinton, were terrible. And the one he produced is brilliant, the best in the world. All that happens is that he's got to be able to say that, even though the agreements differ in minuscule ways, and most people wouldn't bother to go into the detail to recognize that. A little bit of the same kind of thing is happening with China. What seems to be happening is not all that different from what was there before, but just that he can boast that his agreement is the best ever. So those two aspects. But building on that, a great cost to the whole world would be if the multilateral rule-based system collapses as a result. Because if it becomes complete free-for-all, everybody will ultimately lose, including the US. For the others, it might actually be the best thing if they can get together to prevent Trump from kind of picking them apart one by one and negotiate with the US as a whole rest of the world group. That probably is not going to happen, but that would work for them much better than what's happening now.
As a final point, I'd like to talk about your speech topic a little bit about corruption. So recently, India was ranked as the 80th nation among 180 countries in terms of corruption, and it's been labeled as one of the main obstacles to India's continued economic growth. Do you think businesses should have more responsibility in fighting corruption, or do you think corruption should be fought at the hands of the government?
The latter, as I was saying in the talk,
right,
would be a hopeless thing to do, because politicians and bureaucrats are the main beneficiaries from corruption. Mm-hmm. So business has to play a pretty important role. And the real question is what should the nature of that role be and how they can implement it. What you need is kind of leadership in business.
Mm-hmm. So do you think, is there any reason why some countries are more corrupt than others? Is there a factor contributing to this, or is it just poverty and low education?
No, a complicated thing. If you take a long historical span, corruption, where it has gone down for very different reasons. So in some countries it was a big crisis that forced things on them. Classic case is Denmark, which suffered a terrible defeat in a war, and that led to a collapse of the power of the aristocracy, and then the king brought in more professional civil servants gradually. There were totally top-down methods, like in Singapore, where Lee Kuan Yew drove through an anti-corruption drive. There are mixed ones, like the one in Hong Kong, where the government set in motion an anti-corruption agency, but it built a very good social coalition, outreach, education, all those kind of things that ultimately led to success. There are bottom-up things, like one of the ones I mentioned was a youth movement against mafia's extortion in Sicily. So there are all kind of different ways, and you have to look at the context and see what will work well in that context.
Professor Dixit, unfortunately that's all the time we have today. Thanks a lot for your answers, they're very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you, my pleasure.